Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, I'm Alex and today I'm going to talk about all of the books that I read in September. I read 4 books in September, which doesn't sound like a lot, but amounted to nearly 2,000 pages because I had some chunkers in here. The one book that isn't in this stack is The Devil in the Dark Water at nearly 480 pages. It's the only one that I read digitally and is also the one that I'm going to start with first. My first Stuart Turton book that I ever read was The 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle, which I gave 4.5 stars and is still a book that I recommend to this day. So I was excited years later to finally getting around to reading The Devil in the Dark Water, which had been on my digital TBR for ages. The Devil in the Dark Water is a closed room mystery that takes place in 1634 on a ship sailing from Batavia to Amsterdam. On the ship, a powerful and terrifying force known as Old Tom has snuck aboard and is wreaking havoc on the passengers and crew. A mix of strangers and friends are going to come together to try to solve the mystery of what is going on the ship, but each of them will also discover how they ended up on the ship in the first place and how that ties in to the story of Old Tom. Hands down, this was my favorite book that I read this month. I enjoyed the mystery, the characters, the setting, all of it was entertaining. It gripped me right up until the very end, but admittedly the ending is also what detracted a little bit from the story overall because it didn't end the way that I was expecting it to or hoping that it would. Had the ending been different, it would have gotten 4.5 stars just like The 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle. It still gets 4 stars, which is completely solid in my book. It's just such a lively book. I was concerned at the beginning when I first started reading it, after we got an introduction to 2 of our characters, that it was just going to be some sort of knockoff Sherlock Holmes story. It very much was not that. If you want to compare it to Sherlock Holmes, I would say that it's as if Watson made friends and decided to solve a mystery on his own while Sherlock is locked away somewhere and can't really help. The Watson in this case also had way more personality than he ever did in the original Sherlock stories, and instead of being a doctor, is a mercenary instead. Turton excels at mystery with a supernatural bent to it. He always keeps you guessing and there are a lot of moving parts, which is something that I personally really enjoy in my mysteries. If you were going to read this book, I would highly recommend that you get the physical edition. The digital edition is just fine, but there is an illustration at the beginning that shows the details of the ship broken down very beautifully, and it is not convenient to try to flip back on the Kindle edition, so if you want to keep track of where the characters are on the ship and which compartments people are staying in, just get the physical copy. But yeah, like I said, overall, 4 stars. Up next is going to be Light from Uncommon Stars by Rika Aoki. I am not going to spend much time in this wrap-up talking about this book because it actually got its own full review, so if you would like to hear all of my thoughts on this book, you should definitely go check that out here. Katrina is a young transgender runaway who meets the Queen of Hell, Shizuka Satomi. Shizuka decides to take Katrina on as her 7th apprentice for the violin after she hears Katrina play in the park, but little does Katrina know that she is meant to exchange those new skills for her soul. Meanwhile, an alien captain named Lantran is sailing her family across the galaxy to land on Earth and start a new life, and Shizuka and Lan end up developing a bond all their own. This was my least favorite book of September. I didn't like the way it was written, literally. Like, I did not like the way that the paragraphs were broken out, the structure of the book, and I also didn't like the language and the tone that the author used to describe a lot of what went on in the book. The characters are shallow and generally unlikable, and the metaphysics is completely inconsistent with a lot of hand-waving to break rules, which is something that I hate in books. I gave this only 2 stars, but I did read The Light from Uncommon Stars and The Devil in the Dark Water at the same time. I've been trying to read 2 books at once recently to help me kind of break things up, and I usually pick 2 books that are very different in tone, so the next 2 books that I read were The Doors of Eden by Adrian Tchaikovsky, which was both a subscriber recommendation and a subscriber pick for me to read during the month of September. I did a vote on one of my live shows and this one was the one that won. And then I mistakenly decided to also read Desperation by Stephen King at the same time. Now you can tell by the size of these 2 books that they're both quite chunky, and so trying to get through these both together was a little daunting. I won't lie, because Desperation was almost 700 pages and The Doors of Eden was almost 600. And I'm going to go ahead and talk about Desperation first because of the two, this one was the one that I finished first. Desperation is the story of a town with an evil lurking at its depths. As a group of people from different backgrounds, most of whom who don't know each other, drive down Highway 50 in Nevada, which is a very deserted highway, they come across a cop. The cop abducts them in various ways, and as they are journeying to the jail cells in which they will be held, they start to realize that more even than just being abducted, something about this cop is not quite right. I love long Stephen King novels. It, Needful Things, The Stand, Under the Dome. If it's long, I want to read it. Mostly I feel like the character building really comes through for him when he takes the time to really flesh out a story, and this book is no exception. The characters are great and the story's interesting. It just wasn't quite what I was looking for. It gets a big check for having one of my favorite tropes, which is having a kid with supernatural, we'll say, proclivities. This entire story takes place over 24 hours, which compared to the other books that I mentioned is way, way shorter of a time frame. So while I feel like I understood the characters, I don't think that they changed in a lot of meaningful ways. I don't really know that much about them in their lives, and they weren't really in that many unique scenarios either. It's kind of one giant scenario that they're put into. So overall, it's a simple premise. If you want a horror story that takes place over a short period of time with a lot of detail that happens, and you just want it to be to the point, this is definitely a good book for that. I personally think it's limited for a King book of this size, and it's oddly repetitive at times. I really appreciate my subscribers who warned me about the animal death in this book. There is a fair amount of animal death, though it is not prolonged and it is not overly graphic. It's graphic. Okay, it's a King book, don't get me wrong, but it's not overly graphic to the point where you feel like you're lingering on it and really harping on it. It's something that just happens and then you move on. This is probably going to sound kind of weird, but one of the things I love most about King's novels is trying to figure out which characters are going to make it out in the end, because it is never all of them. This book starts out super creepy. The cop and the way that he interacts with all the characters was just chef's kiss perfection. If you are terrified of police brutality or false imprisonment, you will find this incredibly disturbing. I gave this 3.5 stars. It's not my favorite King novel. It's a solid read, but it's not what is ever going to come to the top of my mind if somebody asks me for a Stephen King recommendation. Which I think is fair, because honestly, anytime I've ever asked anybody for a King recommendation, this also is not the book that comes up. People say that they like this book, and I would say that I like this book, but it's never going to be a fan favorite. And lastly, I have The Doors of Eden by Adrian Tchaikovsky, and I can laugh about my feelings towards this book because Robert, my subscriber who recommended this to me, warned me about the ending, and he was not wrong. For starters, how would I even describe this book? It is about a group of people from various backgrounds trying to solve the mystery of freaky shit happening on Earth, including portals that open up to other places. It's not a real technical description, but it's good enough. My favorite part of this book by far were actually the interludes. So at the beginning of the book, we are presented with a flowchart of every era of Earth since life first appeared. And each interlude describes how Earth would have been different if one of those eras had created a dominant life form that carried in to modern time that wasn't humans. Which is really cool and a super fun premise, and I would have actually loved if that would have been a short story all on its own. For the rest of the book, I didn't really like any of the characters. I thought that they were pretty shallow. I'm sensing a theme for part of September. It started out with a lot of promise. It was never going to be a 5-star book once I kind of got into the story, but it could have easily been a 4 had it not eventually gotten hand wavy. The last 150 pages was a slog, and that seems to be another theme for September, is not a lot happened in a lot of pages. We have a pretty large cast of characters in this book for the number of perspectives that we get, and generally, that's something that I like. The Devil in the Dark Water did it beautifully. Characters with different motivations can be really engaging and fun, but unfortunately, none of the characters of this book were interesting enough to stand on their own. If you tried to give any one of these characters their own book, like their own story outside of this novel, it would never work because their personalities are so two-dimensional. This is high concept without being too technical, which depending on how you like your science fiction could be a plus or a minus. In the end, I liked this less than reading Desperation because at least with King's writing, he's always keeping things moving. I can give him credit for that. This just gets 3 stars. I am really hoping, because I still have plans on reading The Children of Time eventually, that I'm going to end up liking that book more than I liked this one. And those are all of the books that I read in September. Please let me know down in the comments if you have read any of these or are interested in reading any of these books, because I always love to hear from you. And as always, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day or evening, that you all stay safe out there, and I'll see you next time.